Hello, hello. Hello, everybody. So we are back. I request everyone to please take your seats because we are going to start with the next session very soon. I repeat, I request everybody to please take their seats because we are going to start with the next session very soon. Welcome back, everybody. Moving on to our next session. The name of the session is 15 Judgements, in which we are going to have Saurabh Kripal and Indrajit Sinha on the judgments that shaped today's India. In conversation with Pratiti Ganatra. Can I have a huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for all the dignitaries on the stage? Can I have mics, please? 3 mics. The stage is all yours. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day one of the Tata Steel Jharkhand Literary Meet. A big thank you to Saurabh and Indrajit. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So today in this session, we are going to be showcasing Saurabh's book. It's called 15 Judgements, Cases That Shaped India's Financial Landscape. So this is the book, and the book is available at the bookstore, which is at the back. You should grab a copy and get it signed by the author while he's here. Okay, so before I ask you the questions, I want to give a heads up that I am not somebody who is associated with the legal system at all. I don't know much about it, so it's going to be a very layman's, perspective or views that I would like to know from you. So in the introduction of your book, you say that the book is not a legal text, aimed solely at lawyers, but it is an attempt to demystify the process. So, I would like to know that with, as somebody who has no knowledge of, this sort of a system, and how do you think people like me will find reading this book?
Well, first, thanks for having me here. And thank you for all of you to actually sit and hear this particular conversation after the very riveting session we had with Mr. Akhtar. I know we can't match up, but, second best is also there. As regards this book, yes, it is written for lay people. It's not written for lawyers. We write enough for lawyers already. You can go and read a judgment, you can read regulations, rules. But what is worrying is that in a country which we say is governed by the rule of law, we believe ourselves to be Indian citizens bound by the Constitution. We believe in the law, yet we have no knowledge of it. Most Indian citizens don't have an idea of what it means to be a person who follows law because they don't know what the laws are. We don't know what the courts have decided. It's just, once in a while you'll read something in the newspaper about a particular judgment that has come. The media misreports a judgment because they're also not lawyers. So I was trying to inform people about how we have come to the economic state of our country today. Because to understand the economy of 2022, you need to understand the economy of 1950 and the progress it took. And in part of that development of the economy, the courts played a very, very important part. The judgments that are discussed in this book, from the very first judgment of 1950, I know we'll discuss that later, so I'm not going to talk about it. But the courts have been, especially in a country like India, such an oversized presence. Courts run everything in our country, everything. So even the economy, it's not surprising that the courts have a massive impact, but we don't discuss enough of what the courts do. So the book is really an attempt to discuss the role of the courts, the role of these judgments, but also to try to understand the socio-economic historical component of a judgment. Each of these judgments came in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, when there was a political philosophy, economic philosophy in mind. So to examine that and the correlations between them, that's why I wrote this book.
No, you're absolutely right. When you write, when I also read the book and went through the chapters, it gave a very good context of the situation of the country when the judgments were happening. So it really made sense to someone like me. Indrajit, for you, as somebody who knows the law very well, how was it for you to read this book and what did you think of it?
I think it was. I think it. Yeah, I think it was refreshing. I think it was refreshing. As a lawyer, we know about these judgments, but we don't read them very often unless and until we have a case. But as a lawyer, when I went through the judgments, and the impact it has, it actually gives you a new perspective. You start thinking that yes, once a judgment is delivered by a court, it actually impacts the, normal man also. I think this book will be very beneficial for law students. So every law library must have it. Universities must have it. It will actually give an idea, and Saurabh has actually done a wonderful job going through all these 15 judgments, which run to hundreds of pages, thousands of pages maybe, to cull out the ratio of the judgments, tell us why the case landed up in court, what was the impact after the judgment was delivered, how it has shaped the country, how it has shaped the constitution today. In fact, the first case which is discussed, and we'll discuss it later, is responsible for the basic structure doctrine. So we all know, lawyers, non-lawyers, everyone wants to talk about basic structure, but why it happened, the first judgment tells us. So that's how important it is for us to, even for lawyers, judges, and law students to go through this book.
So how did you choose that, these particular 15 cases? I'm sure there are like so many that have, had some sort of an impact on our financial landscape, but how did you narrow it down to these 15 judgments?
Well, it's a bit like asking a parent which are your favorite children. There are so many judgments you write which have impacted the financial landscape of India. To choose 15 is obviously some kind of a exercise in just either pure luck or what I find it personally interesting. But the attempt was, I think, to, as I said, link economics, history, and politics. I wanted not to discuss those judgments which have an economic impact, but only on the person concerned. So, for instance, I write that a judgment which says a woman will no longer be or will be a co-parsoner in a Hindu undivided family. Now, that will give a lot of financial strength to the woman and will have an impact on her life within the family. But as a country as a whole, it doesn't have a macroeconomic impact. So my aim was to choose judgments where the courts ruled on matters where the entire country would be affected. And then I chose areas which I found personally interesting and reflected. For instance, we've talked about the very first judgment, Indrajit just mentioned. The courts are very laissez-faire, very right-wing. The politics of the country at that point of time was slightly more radical. We had Pandit Nehru, Ambedkar, all of whom had promised the people that we will have land reform. And I know in a state like this has great relevance. And the battle that happened between the courts on the one hand, which were more right-wing, and the politics, which was more left-wing. So that was interesting. Then we move on another 20, 30 years, when the courts become now more left-wing than the government in the Bangalore water supply case, as to who is a worker, who is an industrialist. The courts now have moved so much to the left that they say everybody is a worker and everyone is entitled to their rights. The government says, no, no, no. If you say that, then even a municipal corporation worker, everybody is entitled to benefits. Don't do that. So the roles got reversed. So this pendulum, and that's what's also interesting to examine in the book, is that this tension between the executive and the judiciary, which is so popular to speak about now. We all talk about it constantly. Look, there's a battle royale brewing. There's a fight between the two. This has been the case since 1950. And that's partly because it's a job of the courts. So that's how I chose these 15 judgments, to showcase how these tensions have always existed and how they've impacted your economic well-being. It's important for you as a citizen to read it.
You mentioned, you just spoke about this, but what I noticed when I read the book was that it's very indicative of the times that, these judgments have happened in, what the courts have ruled. So do you think it's the courts were reflecting the times, or the judgments reflected what was happening later? Like, how did that correlation happen?
That's an interesting question, and that is a question generally about how judges decide. And that's, again, something I think we as citizens must all be aware of. We should make ourselves aware of, because it affects our life. How do judges decide? So the question is, do judges simply reflect the current economic policy, the current political dispensation, the current moral majority, or the current political majority on the one hand, or do they lead it? Do they try to change and bring the majority into their worldview of things? And the answer in that is, I think, kind of symbiotic, which is a bit of both. So the judges try to lead from the front in their conception of what the Constitution is, in what their conception of what economic policy should be, but in doing so, they can't be too far away from the views of the majority either. Judges don't have the same democratic legitimacy that a politician does. So while they change certain views, because the Constitution requires them to, they need to take people along with them as well. And for that reason, I think that they cannot and should not stray too much from some kind of a consensus. In matters of fundamental rights and human rights, I don't think that is the case. In matters of fundamental rights and human rights, it is the responsibility of the judges to move as far away from the majority as is required by the Constitution. But in matters of economic policy, that should not happen. But most importantly, when you ask who leads, it's like a chicken and egg situation. I'd say it depends on the judge. There are judges who will be bound by what, or feel themselves bound by what the majority wants. And there are judges who just don't care, and they will decide the way they want to decide. So, the way we don't have a single government of India, there are 540 MPs in the Lok Sabha, 300 in Rajya Sabha. The judiciary is the same. We have 34 judges in the Supreme Court today. Each of those judges has their different view. So what a court thinks is very much a function of what a particular judge thinks.
Indrajit, what is your view on this? What do you think? How does this correlation work?
As Saurabh said, it's a bit of both, As judges would like to believe that they are writing judgments for the society. And when they write a judgment, I think they think that this is what the society wants. But it's a very individual approach. As he says, it's very individual. One case can land up in a court one day, and I'll tell you, I was arguing before a judge on a particular matter, and the judge says, there's nothing. I'm going to dismiss your matter. You have not read it properly. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow, the next day when I go, the judge changes. And the judge was like, yeah, you have a good case. So the same matter, in a matter of 24 hours, the results change. So what he's saying, judges have a very individualistic approach. Everyone has their own set of ideologies. Some may side with the government. When I say side with the government, may think that the government is right, we will not interfere. One may think, no, I must take a broader approach. The government is not right. I'll decide what the society needs. So therefore, it's actually a circle, and it goes roundabout like that.
Before we head into individual cases...
Can I ask Saurabh a question?
Yes,
the question is, Saurabh, do you think that this is the correct approach the judiciary should work?
A judge should never decide on her or his individual views, because the idea is you take an oath of office when you're sworn in as a judge, that you will abide by the Constitution of India. And the Constitution of India requires you to obey the laws, interpret the laws, follow the laws. So you can't run willy-nilly and say, I feel like this is the right thing and therefore I will do it. You are constrained by the oath of office you have taken. Now you may have certain ideological views about what it means, certain words in the Constitution mean. So what does liberty mean in Article 21? What does life mean in Article 21? What does equality mean for a person on the street? That I can understand judges having a variation in views. But to go from a dispute about language and so much about what lawyers do, the tools of our trade are words, right? But to move away from that and to dispense with, and I find that happens sometimes, dispense with a written word and simply decide what they think should be the correct way. That is a dangerous, non-democratic process and cannot be countenanced.
But don't you think that is also important, because you know what was considered to be good in the 70s may not be good today, and it's happened in many cases like privacy and all. So if I say that judges should not think with the change in society, but they will be bound by what has been already held, is also not correct, because we actually, you know, I think as a lawyer, I feel the most certain thing in this profession or the entire system is uncertainty. So there's nothing which, you know, I'm sure when we take up a case, we don't know what would the result be. Judges are not bound, but judges are supposed to be bound by their own judgments. They're not bound by their own. Everyone has their own. So therefore, this is like, I told you, it's a circle. You know, it's a bit of both.
But when you talk about interpretation, right, there is going to be some amount of personal bias that will come there, correct?
I wouldn't call it bias. I would call it a certain ideological viewpoint, which is inevitable. You know, we don't have robots deciding for us. We don't want robots deciding for us. We are talking about the lives of the citizens of this country. We want other citizens to decide. We want a humane approach in which the feelings of the constitution makers, as captured in the words of the constitution, are there. We want the legislature's words to be applied finally. So this is not a question of bias. It's a question of a particular view of what you conceive certain words to mean. If it was so obvious as to what a word means, matters wouldn't go to court. Right? So there's always room for ambiguity. There is always room for interpretation. That is why lawyers like Indrajit, who are so successful and famous, earn lots of money. Because there is ambiguity, and there's bound to be ambiguity. And that's what's good. It's a clash of ideas, it's a clash of ideals, which is played within the confines of there's not a boxing match, but it's within the confines of the Constitution. And this discussion allows for the steam to come out. And this difference in opinion that is voiced is the same difference that is being carried out in the streets of the country, where people disagree, often vehemently. But ultimately, it is a question of interpretation, and you know, in our constitutional scheme of things, the judges have the last word.
We'll now head to some particular cases, from the book. So first and foremost, can you explain to all of us what was the impact of the First Amendment and the 9th schedule of the Constitution?
I'm going to try to keep this as non-technical as possible, as is the case with the book. So, fresh from the freedom struggle, the entire political class sitting in the Constituent Assembly, before the Constitution is just after it's adopted, but before the elections happen, say that we want to abolish zamindari. We want to give land to the tiller. This system where you have landlords and who are paying, who are getting money from these landless laborers is just unacceptable. So a scheme was devised in the Constitution that we will take over zamindaris and redistribute the land. A question arose about, okay, you take the land from the zamindars, but what compensation will you pay them? Will you pay them anything or not? Because if you have to start paying them market value of their lands, the country was so poor in 1950, we could not have afforded to take away that land and give it to the zamindars. So these laws were challenged in the court. And the court said, on an interpretation of the Constitution, saying that when you are giving compensation, the idea of giving compensation means you give someone value for something. Otherwise, it's no longer compensation. And the act was struck down in the case of Bihar. Two other high courts upheld it, but Bihar High Court struck down the act, and the matter went to the Supreme Court. But even before the Supreme Court could decide, and this was, I think, really two people, Pandit Nehru and Ambedkar, who were so appalled by this fact that the courts had given this decision. And it wasn't just this particular decision on Zamindari. There were two other decisions that happened in 1950. One was a case of reservations. In the state of Madras, there were reservations for certain castes. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's unconstitutional, and struck that down. And then there was a case of sedition, which a judge in the Punjab High Court said, under our constitution, under our right to free speech, there can be no concept of sedition, and struck down the section. Now, these great holders of rights, who we think were great holders of rights, today we talk about them, could not imagine a situation where these rights were conferred on the people. So right to non-discrimination, right to free speech, and economic liberty. And before the first elections were held in Parliament, elections were going to be held in 51, 52, quickly, within a period of 16 days, went and amended the constitution to take away the substratum of these judgments, and virtually the rights themselves were diluted. But it's okay. One thing is to amend the constitution to undo the rights. They thought of a novel idea, saying, from now on, if the parliament says that there are certain laws which we put in something called the 9th schedule, which is an annexure to the constitution, then the courts will not even examine those laws on the ground of violation of fundamental rights. So they become immune from examination. So they can violate all your fundamental rights, but the courts can't do anything about it. So to say that fundamental rights exist or don't exist, it doesn't matter because courts can't do anything about it. And it was famously said that the Indian constitution is one of those constitutions which needs protection from itself. So we have this black hole now of the First Amendment, the 9th schedule. And from 1950, the idea originally was only matters related to Zamindari will go there. Slowly, slowly, you give politicians the power, they're going to abuse that power. It's not a surprise. So we have, from economic matters, Zamindari matters, we have from FERA. We all know how scary FERA was. I mean, there's some young people here who will not know. Industrial disputes resolution, all kinds of acts have found their way in the 9th schedule, and the courts can't do anything about them. Rights which take away fundamental rights of citizens, gone.
That's quite scary.
Done by the first parliament, 1952. It's not just something happening today.
Indrajit, can you talk to us about the R.C. Cooper versus Union of India case? So we, at least the young people here, have grown up in an India where the RBI was already in existence. We know about it, but talk us through the importance of that judgment and how all of that came into being.
That's one judgment, or that in fact the legislation, where you can't doubt the bona fide of the government. Now when R.C. Cooper came, why it came? Because 14 banks were sought to be nationalized. Central Bank, Union Bank, all of these which we know as our PSU, public sector banks, in fact private banks. So the government actually through an ordinance, and interestingly the ordinance was signed by a Chief Justice who was acting as a president at that point of time, tried to nationalize 14 banks. That was obviously challenged by one of the stakeholders, a shareholder and director in a bank. And it was struck down because why 14? But immediately thereafter the judgment came, I'll tell you the importance of the judgment in Indian jurisprudence. There was another act which actually took care of all the constitutionalities. The reason was, at that point of time, banks was generally an urban idea. The banks never reached the rural India. Rural India was financed by money lenders, giving money at high interest rates. And what they came out with Zamindari abolition was actually not being achieved. Tillers were tillers and they became slaves. And so therefore, that is how this judgment which actually, and the law which I say, the after effect of this judgment is the law which actually nationalized the bank, had a far-reaching consequence. Today, the rural India was empowered because of nationalization of banks. Nationalization in all cases was not good. At that point of time, the government was nationalizing everything. Coal mines, banks, everything was being nationalized. But this specific enactment after the judgment struck it down. The law was brought in tune with Part 3. I think it only helped Indian economy to grow. And today we are there again with the onset of liberalization, 1991-93 Narasimha Committee report. Private banks again came back. But by the time now we have banks in India, money lenders are out, almost out. I think they're not there. Concept of money lending is not there. Now, the people who are not aware of this don't even know that there were money lenders, you know, who used to give money at a higher rate of interest, which people would never repay. Their lands would go back mortgaged. So I think that was one of the biggest achievement of the government at that point of time.
If I could just add one thing to this. And while that's true, actually, Indrajit, that was the rationale and reason for nationalizing banks, because there were certain sectors that were not getting money. People wanted to lend only to profit-making businesses and not to agriculture. But actually, if you look behind the surface, the real reason was a political reason.
Correct.
Indira Gandhi had just become Prime Minister. That was a time when the syndicate of the Congress party was very strong. There were struggles within the Congress parties. Lal Bahadur Shastri had died. Indira Gandhi had come in, but she was what was called Gungi Gudiya. And there was a fight there between the Congress party as to how and who will control it. And she came up with this idea that this will be electorally very popular. And this was part of a Garibi Hatao slogan. So she used this. The end result, I think, was probably, Indrajit is correct. We needed nationalization of banks at that point of time. But the rationale was not just the good of the people. The rationale was the good of that one person who thought it was politically beneficial. That we should also be clear about.
To win elections, isn't it?
No, but coming back to the judgment, you know, it had a great impact on the constitutional law. Before that, the judgments or all we knew were like the fundamental rights are watertight compartments. Like Article 14 is a standalone provision, 19. So this judgment actually said that these are not watertight compartments. So jurisprudentially, that judgment was very important. And that is how ultimately Menka Gandhi and everyone followed it and said that what is the importance. If a law can be struck down as violative Article 14, it can also be bad because it is violative Article 19. So I think that is the importance of that judgment. Apart from other, there are small issues which it settled, whether a director can go to a court complaining of Article 14-19 violation, company to what extent can complain, allege violation of fundamental right and all. So I think jurisprudentially, that is a very important judgment.
Another important case that you talk about is the Vishaka judgment. But you say that it was more about, financial inclusion. So how do you say that? Because we all have heard or known about that judgment for like other reasons, but you pointed out that it's very important financially. So
we live in a country where I last looked that 50% of the population of women. We recently had, I was noticing, a state election where in Himachal, where there is only one woman MLA in the entire. Women are disempowered in our country. And disempowerment includes economic empowerment. Right? They're economically disempowered. Now, when you say you want to improve the lot of the Indian polity, when you say you want to actually make India a richer country, can you make India a richer country when half of its population does not have a decent, dignified place to work? It's simply not possible. So as long as you have sexual harassment at the workplace, as long as you have exclusionary practices which disable a woman from being a full part of the workforce, you can't hope to have development. Right? That's one part of it. The second is that a lot of surveys have shown that a place where there's a toxic work culture, companies where women are on a regular basis harassed, or there is infighting, and it's encouraged, the top management encourages fights amongst their workers, those industries and businesses and companies don't do well economically. So it's very important both for a macroeconomic idea of empowerment of women, but also for the well-being of companies to ensure that there is economic empowerment of women. And you would think that when there is a good rationale to have a law against sexual harassment, because companies do better when there's no harassment, that companies themselves would come up with would be interested in this, but that didn't happen. It's only when the Supreme Court stepped in 1997. So from 1950 to 1997, like almost half a century of our constitution, there's no law protecting women from sexual harassment. And the court takes up this case in the matter of a Bhavri Devi, who was a Sathin in Rajasthan. She was a woman who was trying to spread awareness against child marriage. She was going one day and told a particular family who was about to get their young children married, said, don't do this. Went and tried to plead. When she was walking back home with her husband, 5 or 6 men, upper caste men from that particular family stopped her and raped her. Now, you'd think that this is, what has that got to do with Vishakha and work? But that was harassment. She was raped because she was doing her work. That happens to women on a daily basis. May not be rape, but if your environment is so uncomfortable that you can't work, then obviously that has an impact on your how you feed your family, how you feed yourself, how you progress in your career. So there's a very intimate link between harassment and economic well-being, intimate link that most women know. It's time men also find out about it.
You're right. Women do know what it feels like.
This Vishakha judgment is also important, you know, because legislating is the job of the legislature. This was a case where they actually, by a judgment, a legislation was passed. Some certain guidelines, as he said. There was no law on this subject, and I don't know why there was no law. It took the Supreme Court of India to actually lay down the law for the first time that women cannot be harassed. If you harass, you'll face consequences. And as he writes in the book, it ultimately took another 15 years for the government to come out with a legislation. So unfortunately, this aspect was not looked into by the legislature, which claims that we are representing the will of the people. So therefore, this judgment is one of the, on the judicial activism side, is a bright sign that we can also legislate while we deliver judgments.
Can you also throw some light on the Industrial Disputes Act? Like we're talking about protecting women. This was about protecting the labor force. So a little bit about that.
You know, actually, if you go through his book, he's taken up subjects on both. Now, there are many subjects. You can, so relating to employment, these are the 2 judgments which he discusses. There are 2. One is the Vishakha judgment, and one is the Bangalore water supply. Now, the Bangalore water supply case, as he introduced when he started, he said that it was the leftist approach of Justice Krishna Iyer, you know, which came into the judgment, and he actually understood the law, Industrial Disputes Act, to be a workman-oriented law, which in fact is not correct. Later on, it has been doubted. Now the matter is before law. Now, if you look at the industrial dispute, what the definition of industrial dispute, it actually does not talk about dispute between the employer and the workman. It talks about disputes between employer and employer, employer and workman, workmen and workmen. And it is not just a law to resolve disputes inter se or between the, it's there, the main aim is to maintain industrial peace and harmony. So what it does in that process is provides for a mechanism to resolve the issues which may come up. And while it prescribes, there are different mechanisms. You know, it promotes conciliation, that before you go into courts or tribunals, you must try and reconcile dispute. It has set up conciliatory boards. Then it has voluntary arbitration. And then obviously it has the industrial dispute adjudication by the labor court or the industrial tribunal. It also gives protection to the workman that he will just not be thrown out at the whims of the employer. If you have to, you know, if you have to shut down, close an industry, there's a procedure. If you have to retrench, lay off, there's a procedure. It also protects the employer from illegal strikes and lockouts. So you just, the workman can't go. So it's a very balanced act. But anyways, now all these laws are being scrapped and you have 4 codes which will come up. So I'm sure they have taken care of all the things which were left out in these in labor laws or industrial adjudication.
You beautifully explained the ID Act. I like to take the more interesting snippet and discuss that instead. So 2 things I'll take away from this judgment. One is the question, again, that you would ask initially about the biases of judges. What was at the heart of this judgment was, who is a workman? Because if you're a workman, then you have protection of the law. And if you're not a workman, because you don't work in an industry, because you get protection only if you're a workman in an industry. So if it's not an industry, then you don't get protection. So what is an industry?
Yeah, who's defining what is
So
an
that was entirely a question of interpretation that fell. Now, a series of judges till that judgment in Bangalore water supply had held that industry is what it means, industries. So clubs are not, universities are not, municipalities are not. But then comes the judgment of Justice Krishna Iyer, who had a very left-wing approach and said, my idea is to protect as many workmen as possible So what I will do is, I will interpret the term industry as broadly as possible to take everyone into it, and therefore by the process of interpretation, expanded the scope. And that takes me to my second interesting point is, Justice Krishna here, one of the greatest judges of our court in terms of civil liberties. But my God, you pick that judgment up and try to read it. I will give you some, I don't know, a smiley star and a shining star and a smiley face, if you can understand what it says. And that is increasingly the problem we have with judgment. It started, I think, in his time, Krishna Iyer's time, and has gone on now, where judges write in a language which is completely alien to and inaccessible to the common citizen. I think judgment should be written in a language that any person, any citizen, can go up and pick up a judgment, read it, and have some hope of understanding it. Because this is a method of communication between one of our most powerful tools of the state, i.e. the courts. The courts are very, very powerful. They've taken on all the power for themselves. But then when you communicate that power, it is through the modicum or the modium method of your judgments. Those judgments must be comprehensible to the person to whom it's directed. It cannot be written in language which is so flowery that you invent words. Now you invent words, I mean, it takes me back to Alice in Wonderland. You can't understand what it means. So that's the problem.
So just whoever wants to read the Bangalore water supply judgment actually should not read that, should read Saurabh's chapter on it. He actually beautifully, he's broken it down, why it happened, again I say, and what was the impact, and he's actually discussed the judgment in a very simple manner. All the judgments, I think, have been discussed in a very simple manner, simple language, very easy to understand, beautiful written.
I'll share my royalties with you.
Thank you.
But I think you're absolutely right. Like somebody like me would not even dare to pick up a judgment and read it, because you're right, we wouldn't understand anything in it. But also it's important that we do, right? Because it is meant for the people, like you said. Okay. Moving on to the privatization, like the public sector was formed in the 50s when Fabian socialism was basically the, what was going on in the country. So why the need of privatization? How did that happen in the economy? And you talk about the Balco case, which is, one of the more controversial ones when it comes to this privatization. So if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, privatization was simply an idea whose time had come. We tried, as you said, Fabian socialism under Pandit Nehru. It had not quite worked. I don't doubt the intention. The intention was very honest, was to improve the lot of a very poor country. But it didn't work. Partly because more than Fabian socialism, we had moved in the 70s to a quasi-communist state. Not many of you remember, but the highest tax bracket at a certain point in India before reform was 98% of your income, plus 5% wealth tax. So if you earned an X amount, you were supposed to give 103% of that income. So it's better not to earn that money. So obviously, who was going to earn? So it was clear that socialism was not delivering what was required. But then, as so often happens, the pendulum, because it has this inertia, moved from the left to the right. And the attempt after the liberalization of the 90s, in that famous budget of of Mr. Manmohan Singh, followed by the dream budget of Chidambaram and the United Front government, then came the NDA government. And by that point of time, there were two needs. One was to privatize these entities so as to make them efficient. There was a feeling that if it was a government run, and as we all know, when the government runs something, it's not the most efficient. It's surprised maybe to, but that's how it is, right? Government agencies are not well run. And the second was they needed the money. They wanted to sell this asset so that the money that would come would fund the deficit, the budgetary deficit. So there were these two reasons at that point of time. Now, and that's carried on even now. Inevitably, the purpose of selling public sector undertakings is to fill in the budgetary gap. But it's always given the color, no, we want to make it more efficient. That's what's said because that's politically acceptable. So that's the sheen that is given for privatization
Trying
always.
to come off as the good person.
Correct. So that was, I think, the two reasons as to why privatization began. And of course, it was upheld by the Supreme Court in the case of Balco. It was upheld not because it was held to be good economic policy. The court is not in the business of saying that this economic policy or that economic policy is better. It was upheld on the ground that we in the courts don't have the competence. And I wish some of that humility would still exist today in the judges and in people. They had an idea that we are not capable of deciding as to what is the correct economic policy. And if it is a matter of policy, we leave it to you, the government, who will then face the consequences, both in terms of what happens in terms of the economy, as well as in the other great test of your actions, which is an election every 5 years, which I'm being sarcastic about because it isn't.
There are other interesting judgments as well, but we won't talk about all of them because then people will not want to buy the book. But the last question that I want to ask about one of the judgments is on cryptocurrency. It's a term that we all throw around, but I don't really know how many of us really know what it actually means. So how do you think the courts in India have handled this new phenomenon of the cryptocurrency?
I think this is a case where no one has handled anything properly. It's as though in the government, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So what happened in this case is it deals with a ban that the RBI imposed on trading in cryptocurrencies in a surgical strike manner. We seem to love to have these economic policies done overnight. So one night comes a notification saying that we hereby ban trading in cryptocurrencies. Now what's important when I say left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing is because there was complete flip-flop within the government as to whether they should ban cryptocurrencies or whether they should regulate it. Because there was a section in the government, of course, which wanted to ban it, but there was another section which is far more sensible in the government, which did not unfortunately hold way, that banning doesn't work. In our country, we love to ban. I'll just point out to your neighboring state. They banned a substance rather close to my heart, namely liquor. But it doesn't work. Bans don't work. So there is a dispute now as to whether you should ban or not. But ultimately, a ban is done. It is done overnight. The matter then comes to court. And when you read the judgment of as well, again, it will be impossible for any of you to read it because it's highly complex. And again, I will only repeat what Indrajit says. Don't waste your time in trying to read the judgment. Waste a bit of money in my book and read the book instead. And when you read the judgment, it's a flip-flop. Initially, the court says, no, the RBI has the power to ban, so we'll allow them to ban. But then ultimately they say that, yes, you may have the power to ban, but we don't think the ban was the right thing to do in this case. You impeded the economic rights of the citizens in trading in cryptocurrencies. And in doing so, you used a sledgehammer when you could have used a fly swatter. So the court said a prohibition, an absolute ban was not necessary. It was disproportionate. It was an overreaction. So the judicial parlance for overreaction is the doctrine of proportionality, that your action was disproportionate. So that's what the courts did and struck down the ban of cryptocurrencies. After that, of course, that's also been 2 years. It's not as though the government has woken up and done anything about cryptocurrencies. We last heard in the budget that trading in cryptocurrencies, you will have a tax at 30%. But does that mean that cryptocurrency is legal? Are Bitcoin legal? No one really knows. It's just it's a gray area.
That's true, but as Saurabh said, government loves to ban. But there's a chapter in the book which says courts also love to ban. They go on mining. What do you have to say of that?
Correct.
So I think banning everything is there. The government wants to do it. Courts. It's all about again the perspective of the person taking the decision, making the decision. In the cryptocurrency judgment, what I find is that the judges actually didn't have the expertise as in the we don't understand what cryptocurrency is, whether or not, so they didn't want to say that RBI doesn't have the power. It's the expert body. Saying so would be disastrous. But ultimately, they also didn't want to uphold it. Probably, because they felt that we must do something about it. So deployed the doctrine of proportionality principle, easiest thing to do, and say, no, this is disproportionate. Now, that is also a gray area. What is disproportionate to you may not be disproportionate to me. It's relative. So how do we decide all these cases? And if you go through the judgments which here, most of the judgments, lay down a test. Some test or the other is laid down by Supreme Court every now and then. Now, who decides that these tests are good or bad? Only time tests them, time tells us. So, like the first judgment, according to me, and the core of the issue lies in the fact that it's all about supremacy of power. The parliament says that I am supreme. I will not, whatever I do, it will not be questioned. Court says no, will not allow that. We'll question it. Then court says not completely. We'll question it on limited ground. Now, what is that limited ground? It's open to unlimited scrutiny.
Very well said, open to unlimited scrutiny. Before I throw it open to audience questions, just a couple of questions from my side. You mentioned that there is a gap in legal awareness, and we have spoken about this throughout this discussion. But how do you both think that, what is the way to remedy that? Is like these kind of books, are they the only way, or do you see, what can we do to like bridge this gap?
Ban Google. Actually, everyone comes to me knowing the law, knowing judgments more than I do. And that's difficult. Please read the book, don't read Google.
I have a diametrically opposite view. I think anything that will empower the citizen is a good thing. So if Google empowers, by all means, go for it.
That was a joke.
No, I know, no. But my point is, we as citizens simply don't know enough law. When you're stopped on the traffic light, and the cop asks questions, they want to search you, none of us know our legal rights. We would all seen English movies or American movies and say, I have Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to... You know US law, but none of us will know what the law in India is. And as an informed citizenry, that is the only way, other than the elections every 5 years, which I mentioned earlier, the only way to protect yourselves from the tyranny of a majority is by arming yourself with the knowledge of the law. And on that, the responsibility lies on you yourself. Make the effort, read. If it's inaccessible, you can't wait for people like me to write more books. You can't wait for judgments to becoming less prolix. You make the effort. Liberty is not easy, liberty is not cheap, liberty is not free. The responsibility is on you.
Okay, my last question to you. You've also given, after you've explained the judgments, a little bit of your personal opinion also of what you think of the judgments. Are you scared how the legal community will take it?
The one thing I'm not is scared. I think it's a common misconception, and that comes from this power of contempt, that judges get easily upset about the judgments or a critique of their judgments. My experience has shown that while no one likes to be criticized, who does? I mean, I'm sure none of us do. But they are very open to taking criticism. And for every point of view that I've made in this book, it's not as though I have a radical idea which no one else has. It is also part of the mainstream. Because in any society, on issues which are relevant and pertinent, there will be a cleavage of opinions, with most being almost 50-50. So while the court doesn't have or indeed Parliament, have the luxury of saying it's 50-50 and leaving it at that, they have to decide one way or the other. I, as a commentator, have that luxury and saying, well, you said this, but look at that as well. So I think it's taken in the spirit with which it is written. It is written with the spirit of hoping that inquiry will happen at every level of the person reading the book.
Thank you to both of you for answering my questions so patiently. I'd now like to throw it open to the audience. If you have any questions for either Saurabh or Indrajit, you can please raise your hands and a microphone will come to you.
And as we saw, Mr. Akhtar, first two questions are difficult and then it'll all... Your 19(1)A rights have been infringed, I think.
While we are largely agree, that the judgments should be written in a language every person could comprehend. But both of you were a little apprehensive about the views taken by judges, especially when it is contradictory to the interest of the government. But we should understand that those 30, 34 chosen judges, by whatever process, in Indian Constitution being written Constitution, they are the custodian of the Constitution, what we say. The Supreme Court is the custodian of the Constitution. So, when a government take a view which is mostly populist, maybe media also follow the same way, it is their holy duty to have a view. And there is a mechanism in court also. They have 3 judges benches, 5 judges benches, and larger benches. And at the same time, the government also goes some extra mile so that they could meet to some position, some point. So I think that is a very valid thing, having a view by the judges. They are the chosen few. I again reiterate this. So that was my point.
Well, there is no doubt to say that judges have the ultimate authority, as they should. Because if fundamental rights are to have any meaning, they are a protection assured by the Constitution against the tyranny of the majority, right? So the idea is, regardless of what the government wants, the courts will come to your rescue. And so as meeting halfway, I don't agree with at all. They should not be meeting halfway. This clash is going to happen. It's not a process of negotiation that will come to the best solution. The oath of office taken, as I said earlier, by the Supreme Court judges to uphold the Constitution. But my point was slightly different. In matters of constitutional rights, and I said that, there is no halfway house. The only responsibility of a judge of the Supreme Court, or indeed a High Court or even the lower court judges, is to uphold the Constitution and uphold the fundamental rights. When it comes to matters of economic policy, their situation is slightly different. There, the judges, while keeping in mind the Constitution, in terms of the interpretation of the Constitution, of the law, they must pay some heed to what Parliament has decided, what the people of the country want. So economics is, on the one hand, something which is, I would say, leeway should be given to Parliament in matters of fundamental right. And I personally believe many judgments in the last few years have come, and not enough have come, where the rights of the minorities, the right of certain individual sections of society have been protected by the Supreme Court, even contrary to that which the government of the day wanted, and that's the correct thing to do.
I don't think, what both of us trying to say is that judges may have a view, but if the judges take the government's view, that does not mean the government's line is being towed. Government can take a right decision. It's not always for the courts to, strike it down. So if they take a decision where the courts feel that meet the requirements of law, they will uphold it. But you're right. But in many cases, Saurabh has a different approach on, legislature having a greater say. But I say that no, it's rule of law means we are all ruled by the Constitution. Even the legislature, Parliament is bound by the Constitution. Here, everyone, and the duty or the task of the court is to see that the legislature has not exceeded its jurisdiction. That's the only thing. Yes, particular cases one may feel that the court should have done more or court should have done less. But courts have laid down their own procedures, own boundaries, which I feel at times is correct, at times is not correct, at times it's confusing. We don't know what are the boundaries. But decisions are taken. They have their views. I think judges take a stand.
A very good afternoon to everybody. I am Aman Mukherjee and I am a student of law at Chhota Nagpur Law College. So my question would be like, it is quite heartening for me to see like 2 esteemed legal luminaries. I would have went ahead and asked them to explain a lot of judgments that we regularly face in class, and yeah, they are explaining quite well. So there is one thing, the right to die, which was first upheld in Maruti Shripati Dubbal versus state of Maharashtra, and then it was later struck down that it does not come into the ambit of Article 21 of the Constitution in Gyankor case. So, like, how does this progression come up, and what was the how did the court come to the latter conclusion? So, if you will explain it, please. Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. Sorry. You might want to take it.
It's a question on 306 IPC, I believe, where you say 309, that whether I have a right to die, commit suicide or not. So that's on that point.
So, no, in the two judgments you're talking of, interestingly, the first judgment was Justice Kuldeep Singh's judgment, I remember, Justice Kuldeep Singh and Justice Hansaria, which said that right to live includes within it a right to die. So Article 21, which is a positive right, a right to life, incorporates within it a right to die with dignity, right? That was overturned by a constitution bench in Gyan Kaur's case, Justice Verma's judgment. Justice Kuldeep Singh and Justice Verma were best of friends, by the way. Interesting fact of the early 90s. But on matters of law, they differed very, very strongly. What Justice Verma said, and I think he's wrong there, of course, but he held was that a positive right does not necessarily include a negative right. So a right to live does not automatically mean you have a right to not live. And it was on that ground that the earlier judgment was overruled, saying, yes, you do have a right to live, but you do not have a right to die. Now, of course, in that case, all the legal luminaries have been appointed, if you read Gyan Kaur's case, as amicus curiae. So Fali Nariman, Soli Saurabh were both appointed as amicus in that case. And they all said that please allow this right to die, this non-criminalization of suicide, as Indrajit says. Because there is an element of dignity involved also. When a person is moved to such an extent that they are compelled to take their own life, or attempt to, obviously, when you are successful in taking your life, you're not going to be tried, right? You're dead. So the only thing that can be tried is the attempt to commit suicide. So if you are so disturbed that you are trying to kill yourself, the law should not further punish you by criminal action, but should show sympathy. And Article 21 is that. But unfortunately, that argument did not meet muster in the courts, but it has now been legislatively overturned, as Indrajit has said, under the new Mental Health Act.
But I think this has also been recognized in the euthanasia judgment that I will have a right to die. Correct. So it's progressively, again, the Supreme Court is looking into it. That section 309 was an interesting section. If you succeed in what you're trying to do, you die. If you don't succeed, you go to jail.
We'll take a couple of questions more. There.
Hello, I'm K.D. Tiwari from Gramin Upkar Sansthan. In fact, what happens in Jharkhand is that consumer redressal commissions are not functioning. They are defunct. And organizations are trying to get it resolved by the government. But there is an indifferent situation in the, what I cannot describe it here. But should there is any way to get it formalized or get it functional?
The problem that you've pointed out is a very deep problem with all tribunals in the country today. There was a time when justice moved so slowly in our country that a solution was thought that let's declog the courts and appoint specialist tribunals, including the consumer courts. In 1986 it came. That was the idea that we'll start changing. But the reason the courts were clogged was because there were not enough good judges, good lawyers, good infrastructure. Now simply creating another tribunal is not going to change that. Right? The same people who are not qualified to be high court judges are not qualified to be in the tribunals. So that is, we have seen in the last 30, 40 years, a failure of the tribunal system. But specifically in the case of consumer forums, there is a bench of Justice Kaul in Court 2, which is currently sitting, which is monitoring this particular issue on appointment of judges to the consumer forum. The matter has now been pending for about a year in that court. Every 2 months we see, I mean, those of us who go to the Supreme Court, we see the government is being pushed because the appointments have to be done by the government. And the government, for A or B reason, which we can discuss, maybe not in this forum, is not appointing people. So that's how it is happening.
We are associated with the NGOs. So the NGOs can put a pressure. That is, they are the representative of the people. In that case, the students, the law colleges, and the universities should come forward. And for that case, we can celebrate events like National Consumer Day on 24th of December. So these are the things that we can put a pressure on the government, indirectly or directly, but we have to. And what about the judges are not available in that case? These types of organizations can be nominated, or the representative of the organizations can be nominated for the consumer commissions, and government have the ways if they think in proper right direction. That's what I wanted to say.
You know,
Thank
one very
sir.
interesting thing that you say. You have to be so careful about who you appoint as a district judge, consumer forum judge. In Delhi, we recently had a problem that Gurgaon-based consumer forum decided that their job was not consumer redressal, but to take care of dogs. So they said that if a dog bites you, then that is a violation of your consumer rights because you're paying tax and you're a consumer of the municipality. So we hereby go and ban 15 dangerous breeds of dogs. You can have dogs only with muzzles. You can't have more than one dog. So, of course, completely illegal. So you have to be very careful of who you appoint as consumer court judges as well. Because once you have judicial power, you can't have just anyone deciding things.
Okay, we have time for
one
just
question.
one last question. Sir, please make it brief.
अभी कुछ ऐसे निर्णय आए हैं न्यायालयों के जिन पे न्यायाधीशों ने जो तर्क दिए निर्णय के लिए उनका काफ़ी उपहास उड़ा। तो मेरा ये कहना है कि क्या स्वविवेक पे निर्णय ही सर्वोपरि होगा या कोई ऐसा माध्यम बनेगा जिसके आधार पे उनके निर्णय के पीछे कोई तार्किक आधार हो? क्या सर्वोच्च न्यायालय की सर्वोच्चता को अगर कोई बात गलत हो तो उसको कहाँ रोका जा सकता?
See, the judgment, as I say, the Supreme Court is final not because it's always correct, but because it's final. And who are we to question the wisdom of the judges? The Constitution of India, under Article 141, has said that the law declared by the Supreme Court will be binding on everybody. So if you believe in the Constitution of India, then you have no option but to believe in whatever the Supreme Court says, for whatever rationale, for whatever the tark may be. As long as that judgment has come, it is not for the common citizen to start saying, I don't agree with the reasoning. I don't agree with the principle, because that is lawlessness. That is a breakdown of the rule of law. You are bound by that law. Otherwise, everyone will say, I don't think this is correct, and a decree comes or a judgment comes and you don't follow it. So as long as the Constitution exists, as long as the Constitution says what it says, and as long as we as Indian citizens believe in our Constitution, we have no option but to follow what the judgment of the Supreme Court is.
Absolutely. I think whether we like it or dislike it, we are all bound by it. So, but I think all judgments जो आते हैं सुप्रीम कोर्ट में उसमें तो reasons रहते हैं सर. आपसे कहते हैं reasons नहीं है, वो कुछ dismissal SLP हो गया, वो अलग बात है. But reasons तो रहते हैं हर judgment में. आपको पसंद नहीं आया, मुझे पसंद नहीं है, वो अलग बात है. नहीं, logic तो रहता है, वो तो रहता है सर. अब इतने इतने pages लिखते हैं हमारे judges, आप कह रहे logic नहीं. हाँ, वो तो होगी सर, हमेशा चर्चाएं होंगी.
Okay, I think our time is up. You can speak to our authors backstage. They'll be there at the bookstore, and you can also get a copy of Saurabh's book and get it signed by him. Thank you so much once again, Saurabh and Indrajit, for taking time out and having this very insightful discussion with us here this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Indrajit, for taking time off.
Thank you,
his busy
Saurabh.
career.
All the best for your book.
So with this, we come to the end of this beautiful session, knowledgeable and session full of wisdom. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, moving forward to our next session. The name of the session is Tales of